Good morning, everyone. The story of Abraham and the virtual sacrifice of his son Isaac on Mount Moriah is so well known that we need no reminder. That's in chapter 22. But what is sometimes overlooked, though, is that before that most famous of incidents, Abraham had caused to sacrifice another of his sons. Not a special, miraculously born son like Isaac, but a natural born son. A son born in the ordinary way, as Paul describes it in Galatians. Abraham's son Ishmael, born of the union between Abraham and Hagar, Sarah's handmaiden. And that event happened just one chapter earlier in Genesis 21, as we read this morning, possibly a dozen years or so before the sacrificial incident with Isaac in chapter 22. The story of Abraham sacrificing Ishmael is often overlooked. But the story itself and the juxtaposition of that incident with Isaac on Mount Moriah is no less significant for us in terms of its spiritual significance. The conception and birth of Ishmael was completely unlike that of Isaac, humanly planned and ordered. We pick up the story in Genesis 15, and you may want to just follow this through with me this morning as we look at some of the narrative. In Genesis 15, where God made a covenant with Abram to the effect that he would have descendants. He would have lots of them, more in fact than there were stars in the sky. Now, humanly speaking, that of course was impossible. Abraham was already a very old man, well into his 80s. As was Sarah, his wife, well past the age of childbearing, even for those days. And in any event, Sarah was barren. It looked as though Abram's estate would go to his trusted servant, Eliezer of Damascus. But God was insistent. No, Abram, you are going to have a son. And the record simply says in Genesis 15:6 that Abram believed God. But as to how it was all going to happen, he had no idea. But not so Sarah. Sarah was nothing if not a practical, down-to-earth, do-it-yourself type, full of ideas as to how to help God out. And so the story has it in the next chapter, chapter 16, verse 1, that Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go in unto my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." These days we would call it surrogacy. Surrogacy doesn't appeal to everyone. There are lots of legal issues and moral challenges with it, let alone the emotional, psycho-sociological ramifications. But surrogacy has gone on in various forms, various ways right down through the ages. And no doubt Sarah figured that this was the easiest way, possibly the only way that she knew of, to facilitate God's promise about Abram having lots of children, and she was a facilitator. So Sarah persuaded Abram, and I imagine her to have been a very persuasive person, and in due course Hagar became pregnant. But the path of surrogacy seldom runs smooth, and Genesis 16 from verse 4 says that when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Unfortunate, yes. Unhappy, absolutely, but not entirely surprising. We're dealing with very ordinary people here, you know. But what might have been surprising, for Abram at least, was Sarah's response, because chapter 16 verse 5, Sarai said to Abram, "It's all your fault. You're responsible for this. I put my servant in your arms and now she knows she's pregnant. She despises me." Now, while it was entirely unreasonable of Sarai to blame Abram for the consequences of the plan that she had devised and that she had persuaded him to go along with, none of us have a problem believing it, do we? I mean, nothing changes really much in life over the centuries. The story is, well, it's just so raw, so human. And so is Abram's response to his wife. It was no use trying to reason with Sarai in the state that she was in. So verse 6, "Your servant is in your hands," said Abram. "Do with her whatever you think best." So in our all too human story, Sarah did what she thought best. She did exactly that. She did what she thought best. She did what came naturally to her. She mistreated Hagar. Mistreated. It says, I wonder what is concealed in those words. Today we might say she bullied her. It's not good, Sarah. She mistreated Hagar, and Hagar ran away. Remember, Hagar was pregnant with Ishmael at the time, who in due course was to become the progenitor of the Arab peoples. What a context that is to the centuries-old bitterness between Jews and Arabs. What an all-too-human context, not just for what immediately follows, but for what was to happen down through the ages, right down through, 4,000 years or thereabouts to where we are today. Just think about it. God makes Abram some fabulous promises about having a son through whom there will be countless descendants. And concerned about the physiological impossibility of it all, Sarah initially hatches a plot concerning a son and heir, an all too human plot, surrogacy. The plot of a headstrong, energetic, proactive, self-help, do-it-yourself, no-nonsense matriarch who wants to make things happen. Or to make things happen for God, of course, you understand. But, whoops, she later decides that the plot was maybe not such a good idea after all. She hadn't quite thought of all the angles. It's too late, Sarah. It's too late. You have to deal with the consequences. You and all the Jewish people who are to descend from you for the next few thousand years. You've got to live with the consequences of trying to play the role of God yourself. Trying to tell God his business. Trying to do his work for him. Indeed, trying to work your way of doing things into his will. It's been the Jewish problem from day one. Instead of waiting on him and letting him reveal his will in his own way, in his own time, even if it is mysterious, miraculous, humanly impossible. And now there are consequences. Consequences? What consequences? Sarah hoped she was never going to hear from Hagar again. Hagar's run away. Nothing to see here. Wipes her hands of the whole thing. She's been run out of town. Sarai, she settles back down to life as it always was, the life of a barren woman with an over-optimistic head in the clouds husband who keeps on going on about God and the impractical promises that he imagines God has made to him. Now, I suppose Sarah's just going to have to hatch another plot for them both now to keep them happy. But God has other ideas. First, God cares about bullying. Our God notes mistreatment and injustice wherever it occurs and whoever commits it. God knows. God sees. He has his eye on Hagar. Chapter 16, verse 7, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. You know, it's interesting, isn't it? God knows those who were lost, and he knows where to find them. The shepherd always finds the sheep. No matter how often the sheep think that the initiative is with them, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert, and he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from? And where are you going? Strange questions, really. When you think about it, the angel already knew the answers to both questions. But perhaps the questions were designed more to jolt Hagar back into reality than anything else, to bring her back to her senses, to help her understand that she wasn't entirely blameless in this predicament in which she found herself, and if she persisted, she too had a lot to lose. "I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai," Hagar answered in her brief moment of insight. I'm running away. And the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." You too are at fault, Hagar. You despised your mistress because you became pregnant while she remained barren, and now in running away, you stand to lose everything that you might have gained. Submit, Hagar. There's no other way out of this. You need to submit. And again, there are echoes down through the ages, aren't there, of the problems that in the Middle East today and the implications for the ultimate resolution of the Jewish-Arab conflicts. Ultimately, Hagar's descendants will also have to submit to Sarah's seed, ultimately. But make no mistake, God cares about all Abraham's descendants, not just those born of a promise, but those too who carry children who are to be born in the ordinary way. God had promises for Hagar and her seed as well. Chapter 16, verse 9, if you go back to your mistress Sarai and submit to her, God will increase your descendants, Hagar, so that they too will become too numerous to count. You are now pregnant with a son. You shall call him Ishmael, meaning God hears, because the Lord has heard of your misery. We don't often talk of the promises to Hagar, do we? They don't figure much in what we talk about, but they're very significant promises. So Hagar returned to Sarai. She apologised, she disciplined herself to refrain from despising a mistress. She bit her tongue. She submitted, and in due course she bore Abram a son. She named him Ishmael. God hears me. A simple but powerfully reassuring sentiment for a slave woman, I would have thought. God hears me. Not just the elite. Chapter 16 ends by telling us that Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. Just reflect for a moment on the state of Jewish-Arab relations today. The Jews steadfastly resisting the God of the New Covenant, wanting to do it all themselves, insistent on doing things their own way in their own strength, with their frequently bullied Arab neighbours. Not that the Arabs are cleanskins either. They mock and harass their Jewish masters at every turn, foolishly inviting the harsh treatment they get from their Jewish masters. The Arabs too, like their ancestor Hagar, will one day have to submit. But the ultimate resolution awaits the Jews, the modern-day descendants of Abram and Sarai, yielding to the God of the New Covenant, allowing finally God to do things his way. But for now, back to the story. Hagar returns. She knuckles down to life under a domineering Sarai. Time passes. Lots of time. 13 years pass by the time we come to chapter 17. And the boy Ishmael, Abram's natural-born son, grows into a young teenager. And maybe even Sarah gets used to the idea, as bitter as it may be for her, that Ishmael is the promised seed. And I suggest, in fact, I have no doubt that Abram thinks that this is the case anyway, and for him there's no bitterness. After all, Ishmael is his son, his own flesh and blood. Perhaps there's just sadness that Sarah has found the whole thing heart-wrenching, and that underneath the routine daily politeness of the household, a real unspoken resentment has grown up between Sarah on the one hand and Hagar and Ishmael on the other. 13 years of this polite, unspoken resentment. Because the opening verse says in chapter 17 that Abram was 99 years old when God next appeared to him, or at least this was the next recorded divine appearance to Abram. And in this next appearance in chapter 17, God again reminds Abram of his covenant, and he decrees circumcision as the sign of the covenant to show the utter solemnity of his promise, his absolute guarantee of receiving the promise from God. In fact, the same day that God speaks to him, the 99-year-old Abraham takes his 13-year-old son Ishmael, and all those born in his household, it says, even the servants, every male in his household, and he circumcised them all as God had instructed. Surely that act alone would have convinced Abraham, if he had not already been convinced, that Ishmael was the one. Abram's only son at that point, his only son, the only son he was ever going to have through natural means, circumcised the same day as his father. He's the one. Can there be any doubt? Circumcision, the sign of the covenant, the sign of God's promise to greatly increase Abram's family. Ishmael circumcised the same day as his father. This must be God's plan. God reinforces the covenant with a name change. No longer will you be called Abram, meaning exalted father. Your name will be Abraham, meaning father of many, for I have made you into a father of many nations. I will make nations of you. Kings will come from you. As for Sarai, I want you to change her name as well. She is to be called Sarah, verse 16. I will bless Sarah and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will become the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. Here we go again. We've been down this track before. This is where we were 13 years ago. We've already been down this track, Lord. There are problems, remember. With Sarah, it's just not doable, It won't work. And so chapter 17, verse 18, Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. Please, Lord, let it be Ishmael. He's been circumcised as you commanded. He's my son, my very own flesh and blood. He's a fine lad. Sounds like a plan. Yes, says God, I know that's your plan, Abraham, but it's never been mine. I told you Sarah would have a son. I know that's impracticable. I know it can't be done. It's laughable. In fact, that's why you're going to call the boy Isaac, meaning laughter. Because it just can't happen. But I tell you, Sarah will have a son. And you will call him Isaac, and it's with laughter, contemplating the impossibility of it all, that my covenant will be established. And let's just pause there and reflect for a moment about the impact of this on Abraham and his household. Ishmael as the heir made sense. He was literally Abram's flesh and blood. His firstborn son, his only son at that point, had been for 13 years. He was from his birth an integral part of the family. If by some miracle another son, a younger son, is going to come along and inherit everything from Abraham, just think what effect that's going to have on Ishmael. Ishmael himself is almost certain to feel cheated, overlooked, second-rate. Through no fault of his own, remember. It will also inevitably undermine the already uneasy truce between Sarah and Hagar. All true? Yes, all true. But that's not God's fault, is it? It's all a result of Sarah's insistent surrogacy plan to play God herself. Chapter 18 then follows with what I always find to be the spine-tingling story of the three men, the three angels in the guise of ordinary travellers visiting Abraham and Sarah in their tent near the great trees of Mamre. And I can always picture this beautiful scene. And many of God's children have entertained angels unawares. And it's spine-tingling, yes, because I wonder whether Abraham and Sarah even want to contemplate the possibility of being parents together for the first time at their age. Abraham knew there was something special about these men, especially when one of them said quite calmly, "I'll return again to you about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son." The record says, chapter 18, verse 10, that Sarah was behind the man's back, listening at the entrance to the tent. And she was so advanced in years and so past the age of childbearing, she laughed to herself as she thought, after I'm worn out and my husband is so old, now will I have this pleasure. And we've already been down this track, and she had a little laugh. And then the man, the angel, the Lord, said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." And on hearing this, Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I didn't laugh." But the Lord said, "Yes, you did laugh." When the Lord wants to deal with us, no excuse, no protest, no white lie ever stands a chance. So the men went on their way down towards Sodom and Gomorrah, which we read about in the rest of chapter 18 and 19. And chapter 20 then relates the story of Abraham's interaction with Abimelech, king of Gerar. Then we come to the birth of Isaac in chapter 21 from our reading this morning. Verse 5, Abram, he was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. So we've got Ishmael about 13, 14, thereabouts, young teenager, and then Isaac is born. Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." You know, it's amazing, isn't it, how far some people will go to protect their reputation? Sarah, really? God has brought me laughter? That's not why he's being called Isaac. It's because you, Sarah, you thought the very idea of giving birth at your age was laughable. That's why. Still, verse 8, the child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast, and Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham, notice even at the moment this is all the way he would be known as this. That's the son that Hagar the Egyptian had borne to you, Abraham. He was mocking. And she said to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." Needless to say, verse 11, the matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son, Ishmael. What Sarah was demanding was that Abraham send his son, Ishmael, away for good. Just banish him. That Abraham's firstborn son be permanently banished from the household, never to come back again. And before you say, "Oh, yeah, but Ishmael, he was asking for it," he wasn't. He was a 13-year-old lad doing probably what 13-year-old lads have done right down through history. He didn't deserve this. Get rid of the slave woman and her son. That was a truly monumental ask. A monstrous ask, even in sheer human terms. There is no way today that we could ever justify an action like that, given our genteel 21st century values. There's no way. Can you imagine Abraham's agony? I also think we can deduce from the record that in the ordinary course of events, there was no way that Abraham was going to comply with Sarah's wishes either. He wasn't. I mean, normally he would do it for a quiet life, but this isn't going to happen. And I say he wouldn't have done so had it not been for the fact that Sarah's wishes were reinforced by God himself. Verse 12, God said to Abraham, "Don't be so distressed about the boy and your maidservant. In this instance, do what Sarah demands. It is indeed through Isaac that your seed will be reckoned. As for Ishmael, I haven't overlooked him. As for Ishmael, I will make him into a nation as well, because he is also your offspring." And so faithful Abraham, forever doing unswervingly as he is directed by God, somehow, and you can imagine the emotional trauma of this, he gets his act together to do the unthinkable. And not just to do the unthinkable, but, to do it the next day. When God demands something of Abraham, he does it immediately. Even if in this case it means he's never going to see his son Ishmael ever again. This man Abraham, he's a giant of unparalleled faith. So verse 14, early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water, and he gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba, and when the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. She went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, "I cannot watch the boy die." And she sat there. She or the child, probably both of them, began to sob. But God heard the boy crying. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "Don't be afraid, Hagar. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift him up, Hagar. Take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." We never seem to talk about God's promises to Ishmael either, do we? And then God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. And so she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy as he grew up. As one of the prophets would later say of God, he is a father to the fatherless. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. And while he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. Well, where else is she going to get a wife for him, I suppose? When you've lost connection with the household of God, there's only ever Egypt. So it's not surprising. But tragic? Oh, tragic. An utterly tragic sacrificial event brought about right at the start by an all too human plan to manufacture something to help God fulfill his promises. Then in the very next chapter, 22, we have the story of God testing Abraham with surely the hardest divine test of any recorded in Scripture. It's such a startling incident in chapter 22, such a stark and terrible command. It's not surprising that it tends to completely overshadow the tragedy that has just befallen Abraham in the previous chapter. Abraham, take your son, your only son, Isaac, because the other one's gone. Your only son, Isaac, whom you love. But wait a minute, only son, he might have been banished. But what about Ishmael? Ishmael was also Abraham's only son for the first 13 years of his life at any rate. Abraham loved him too. He was before Isaac. Sure, in the pure legal sense, Isaac might now be the one and only heir. That's been done. But in a very literal parental sense, there would always be Ishmael. You can't just airbrush him out of the family album. Ishmael was the first to be born to Abraham, even if he didn't now qualify as the firstborn for the purpose of inheritance. True, Ishmael was no longer the heir, but there would always be Ishmael. He would always be Abraham's firstborn son. His memory was always going to haunt the family. You know, in the New Testament, Paul in Galatians comments on the story at length, and he makes an allegory of the two women, Hagar and Sarah, contrasting the old covenant with the new covenant. It's a fabulous allegory. We're not going to go through it in detail this morning, but look at it in your spare time. It's a brilliant allegory. But the blunt, matter-of-fact way in which Paul puts it all in Galatians 4 is it's necessarily devoid of all the human emotion and the psychological trauma that would have gone on with the original incident. He is, after all, in Galatians, he is developing an allegory. He's making a point. He's not narrating a heart-wrenching Bible story, but we can so easily miss the pathos of the historical event with the abrupt, cold way that Paul, and it is, he puts it so coldly, so clinically in Galatians 4. But as I say, necessarily, he says, "Tell me, you who want to be under the law, are you not aware of what the law says? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman, the other by the free woman. And his son by the slave woman was born according to the flesh, but his son by the free woman was born as the result of a divine promise. These things are being taken figuratively. The women represent two covenants. One covenant is from Mount Sinai and bears children who are to be slaves. This is Hagar. Now, Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem because she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem that is above, she is free, and she is our mother. Now, you, brothers and sisters, he says, like Isaac, are children of promise. You're the children of the promise. And at that time, the son born according to the flesh, Ishmael, persecuted, it says, persecuted. Well, made a bit of fun of, but persecuted for the sake of the allegory, the son born by the power of the Spirit, Isaac. It is the same now. But what does the Scripture say? Paul continues making the allegory. The Scripture says, get rid of the slave woman and her son, for the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with the free woman's son. Therefore, brothers and sisters, we are not children of the slave woman, but of the free woman. Get rid of the slave woman and her son, for the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with the free woman's son. It's true. Absolutely. But it's sadly and bitterly true. There's a spiritual principle in that statement that stands good for all time. But in a natural sense, that sort of good riddance, get rid of them. That sort of sacrifice, well, that's what it is. That sort of sacrifice, it really hurts. And it really costs. And it's bound to affect our lives powerfully, profoundly, and forever, as it did for Abraham. Remember, Abraham did not want to banish Hagar and Ishmael. He certainly wasn't prepared to send Hagar and Ishmael away just because Sarah demanded it. If it had been his choice alone, it's clear he wouldn't have done it. God had to intervene to reassure Abraham. This time, Abraham, do what she says. Heaven knows Sarah hasn't always been right, but this time, Abraham, do as she says. You have to send Ishmael away. You have to give him up. You have to give him up for good. Can you possibly imagine the trauma of obedience that confronted Abraham? Think about it in terms of your own children. Appreciating the background to the story of Abraham sacrificing Ishmael in this way, surrendering him to the mercy of God, and applying Paul's allegory in Galatians 4 to our daily lives. The painful lesson for us is, I suggest, that sometimes, and this is it, brothers and sisters, this is the takeout, Sometimes we have to sacrifice the good in order to obtain the best. And let me say it again for emphasis. Sometimes we have to sacrifice what is good if we're ever going to obtain the best. You see, this natural life, as represented by Hagar and Ishmael, it's not inherently bad. Oh, it can be for sure, but it's not inevitably, not invariably so. The child born in the ordinary way doesn't always mock the child born of the promise, not always. Often the child born in the ordinary way is just plain playful and lovable and admirable, even deserving in some senses. And yet, if we are to have life and to have it more abundantly as Jesus promised, if we are to experience absolutely everything that the life of Christ has to offer, the teaching of Jesus is that we must abandon the natural life. We must sacrifice it, traumatic though it may be at times. Sacrifice, surrender, banishment, whatever term you wish. We must banish the child born in the ordinary way in order that the child born of the promise can enter into its rightful inheritance. It's as Jesus said, only those who lose their natural lives can ever hope to find their true spiritual ones. The Gospels are full of this teaching in various forms. Jesus said to his disciples that those who would come to him must first deny themselves, take up their cross and follow in the sacrificial steps of their Lord. Lord, they said in response, Lord, we have left everything to follow you. And remember, that statement for the disciples wasn't just hyperbole either. It wasn't just idle banter. It was quite literally true. They did give up families, friends, homes, careers, businesses, security, reputations, freedom, ultimately their lives. They gave it all away. Lord, we've left everything to follow you. They meant it. What about us? Their response surely raises the question for us, what have we given up of our natural lives to follow Jesus? To pursue the spiritual blessing embodied in Isaac, the child of the promise. You know, modern Christianity is full of people who seek the spiritual blessing of Isaac without first sacrificing their natural affinity for Ishmael. And the blessing of the Spirit doesn't come like that. It just doesn't work that way. The natural always precedes the spiritual, never the reverse. The natural must be surrendered before the spiritual can flourish. I'm not talking about giving up sin here, sacrificing sin or something like that, overcoming it. I mean, giving up sin, it should go without saying. I don't imagine we're so ignorant as to be in any doubt about that. I'm speaking rather of the need to sacrifice even the good of this natural life in order to obtain the best of the spiritual life that we've been promised and to which we've been called. The notion of sacrifice carries with it the twin ideas of personal loss and a commensurate sense of cost. And that was surely the experience of the apostles in effectively losing their natural lives at the cost of forfeiting every benefit their natural lives otherwise had to offer. Whatever was to my profit, Paul said, whatever was to my profit, I consider loss. So what about us? Are we up for the real thing? For sacrificing even the good of this natural life in order to obtain the best of the spiritual life? Is that why spiritual life doesn't seem to be working for us? You know, many disciples have sacrificed the good down through the ages in order to obtain the best. There have, for example, been people who have given up the person they loved and walked away from a possible loving marriage relationship because it wasn't going to promote the best spiritual outcome. They sacrificed the good in order to obtain the best. There are those who have turned down promising career opportunities because they counted some other life path as being more congruent with their spiritual calling, sacrificing the child born in the ordinary way in order to obtain the blessing given only to the child of promise. Still others have suffered hardship and deprivation volunteering in the mission fields or in providing selfless service in the poorer sectors of society, or even among the prisoners and the drug addicts, and when they could have been enjoying the comforts of home and the settled lifestyle of the self-contented, surrendering Ishmael in order to clear the path for the child of promise. Admittedly, those examples are all quite spectacular, but not every sacrifice has to be on that sort of scale. Let us never forget that Abraham offered up Ishmael before he offered up Isaac. Too many of God's people deceive themselves that they can offer up spiritual sacrifices before they have first surrendered the natural, but it can't be done. If we don't sacrifice the natural, the spiritual can never flourish and can never enter its inheritance. And what's more, God will not actively be involved with our natural lives as long as we continue to pamper and gratify them. But if we do sacrifice the natural, if we put it out there in the desert, then just as with Ishmael, God will be involved with our natural lives as well, providing us with all the essentials we need. God will find us, even if, like Hagar and Ishmael, he finds us in tears. He'll find us, and he'll take care of both the natural as well as the spiritual, of the child born in the ordinary way, as well as the child of promise, thus fulfilling the promises he's made to them both.